To have a successful experience with your inventory software, three things got to be in place. First, it's got to be the right software that fits your company's needs. The features need to do what you need them to do. Step two is it's got to be set up right. And step three, it's got to be used right. If you don't have those three things in place, then your experience with your inventory software won't be a success. We walk you through a 5-step implementation process: design workflow, set up the sandbox, procedural design, document individual procedures, assign roles and responsibilities. 4 is training and practice. 5 is go live. I'm Lance, inventory software expert since 2006, and in this video we're going to talk about step 2 of our 5-step implementation approach, and that is setup. So when I first started inventory software implementations back in 2006, I mainly focused on training. And if you've watched my training video, I've talked about how my implementations worked when we just trained and did nothing else and went on. I think I had about a 30% success rate with that approach back in the early days. Then around 2009, I started helping people set up the software before we trained. And it's probably brought the success rate from about 30% to 50 or 60%. Still not where we want to be, but definitely shows how important step 2 of a successful implementation is, and that is set up a sandbox. Step 2 is set up a sandbox. Now, of course, this depends on how large your company is. If you're a 1 user, 2 user, 3 user, if you sell only under $1 million a year, you're probably in the plug and play range. If you have just a few parts, then setup just means put your part numbers in your inventory software, your customers, vendors, prices, costs. Get it set up and start using it. May not even need training, but I mostly work with companies that are considering inventory software when they're at the $1 million mark up to like the $20 million mark, and then after they start using the software takes them more to the $100 million mark or the $200 million mark, right? So that's kind of my perspective, and that's where I'm coming from. So with those projects, in order to have a successful experience, 90% of the time, especially with the 5 users, the 10 users, the 20 users, you need a sandbox. You need to start out with a sandbox. And what a sandbox is it's a copy of your software. You install your software and then you put all of your data in it. If you're reevaluating a failed implementation, which I work a lot with those, then we take a copy of your live account and then install a parallel account, or ask, if you're in a SaaS model, ask the company to create a Sandbox account for you in the cloud that replicates your live account. So there's 2 scenarios I'm talking about. The fresh scenario where you haven't started using the software yet. Your first copy, that's going to be your sandbox. If you've had a bad implementation that you're trying to fix, then make a copy of your live account. Even if you think it's messed up, it's still a good start, and we can clean it up in the practice file or the sandbox file, right? But that's our goal, is we want to create a realistic environment for people to learn in. And some people think, well, okay, a sandbox is just a few parts and a few bills of material, a few customers. That's not what I would consider a sandbox. I would consider that a proof of concept. And for some of you, that makes sense. We've done proof of concepts for companies, and that really makes sense and works well, where before you even buy the software, you prove it out, you test it, right? So in this video, I'm assuming you own the inventory software already, and you want to either fix your implementation or do it right the first time. And so this is what a sandbox is. It definitely can start with a few parts, and a lot of the times it needs to start with a few parts or a few customers. All right. Then we want to, however, progress to a full filled out account or a fully filled out file. I call it a file, call it a database. It's called different things. And that's our goal, is we want a realistic feel to our experience without it yet being live. Okay. So if you have questions about your part numbers, your units of measure, how it maps to QuickBooks, maybe your bills of material, if you need to answer these questions, what's the best way for you to set up the bill of material, or what settings, what automatic settings should be turned on or turned off, what boxes should be checked or unchecked, right? Then yes, start with a small subset of data, test it out, and then once you understand what works best, what part type to choose, for instance, that's usually a big decision, is what part type should this part be? What unit of measure should this part be? Maybe what costing method should you be using? Answer these questions with a small subset of data, and then walk through the entire workflow. So yes, I have these in steps. Step 1 is document desired workflow. Step 2 is setup. Step 3 is document procedural design. Individual procedures and roles and responsibilities, right? But obviously you can go back and forth with these steps. So step 1 sometimes works hand in hand with step 2 in the small subset. Once you have your workflow, sometimes you may need to look at the software and test out a small subset to decide what your desired overall workflow should be. And the desired overall workflow, I've got a video on that. How should you enter a sales order? Who's going to do that? How should you enter a work order? Who's going to do that? How should you enter a transfer order? Who's going to do that? Et cetera, et cetera. Purchase order creation, purchase order fulfillment, work order fulfillment, transfer order fulfillment, sales order fulfillment, right? That kind of goes hand in hand with the question, how does this inventory software work? If you don't know how it works, then a key person in your company that you should assign to the project, which is a critical piece to the success of your implementation, a key person should be testing the software out, learning the software, or being taught how to use the software with a small subset. So step 1 and step 2 kind of go hand in hand a little bit. But once you've figured out the best way from a bird's eye view, from a high level, once you've figured out the best way for your company to use the inventory software and you've tested it out with a small subset of data, then we want to get the rest of the data in there, even though it's not the live file. So hear me out on this. I've experienced a lot of failed projects not doing what I'm about to tell you. And sure, there are exceptions to this rule, but this is the general rule for a successful implementation, is get all of your data in there. Customers, vendors, parts, locations, bills of material, prices, pricing rules, get it all in there. Set it up as if you were going to go live. Now, most software companies have a way for you to convert that sandbox into live when you're ready later on. But we want a realistic environment for people to learn in. And we want to fully test everything. Everything. All the features. And if you don't get all of your data in there, you're not going to have a fully tested experience or a good training and practice experience. Okay, so get it all in there. Now, sure, the exception to the rule, I think I've run into this once or twice, and since I've been doing this since 2006, where it didn't make sense because they just had so much data. It was crazy. They had like 20,000 parts, so we just put in 5,000 parts, I think, and that was fine. So this setup now gets you involved in spreadsheets. If you've never done this before, it looks like a lot of spreadsheet work. Step 2 in our 5-step implementation approach has a lot to do with spreadsheet work. Preparing the spreadsheet in a way that the inventory software will accept. Sometimes the inventory software has mapping fields, whether it's a browser-based software or a desktop-based software. It's all a similar concept where the data is built upon data, and one type of data should be imported before another type of data. Let me give you an example. So customers and vendors, or customers, usually can go in first, almost first. Maybe you need to connect to Quickbooks and pull over tax rates or terms that apply to those customers, right? So you kind of start from foundational data and build up to high-level data. So things like units of measure, terms, carriers, things that a customer is assigned to would go into the software first. A lot of inventory software programs connect to Quickbooks and pull this data over automatically. Some of them don't. And sometimes, even if they do, you may not want to because your data in Quickbooks is a mess. So consider exporting it out of QuickBooks Online or QuickBooks Desktop onto a spreadsheet, reconfiguring the data layout, and then importing that data into the inventory software. So foundational, there's an order to this madness. Some data needs to be put in before other data, or you're going to get error messages. That's one thing we do here at Brando Consulting is we help you avoid those error messages. We've done this hundreds of times, and we know the order of the method, right? What order the data should go in. Part number imports, vendor part number imports, all this data, account mapping to QuickBooks. Oftentimes, and this brings up the point of the QuickBooks side of things, when you're implementing inventory software that connects to QuickBooks, which is what we do here at Brando Consulting, you oftentimes need to rethink your chart of accounts. When you first set up your chart of accounts, it was back in the day before you had inventory software. And now some of those accounts and the way you set up your chart of accounts may not necessarily work with the way your inventory software connects to QuickBooks. And the inventory software may take care of some things that QuickBooks didn't. So because you are beginning to look to the inventory software for your reporting needs rather than QuickBooks for your reporting needs, then the way you've set up QuickBooks with classes or accounts may change. You may want to do it different when connecting the inventory software. So part of setting up a sandbox is connecting the inventory software to a copy of QuickBooks. Of course, you don't want to connect the inventory software to your live QuickBooks, right? We're not ready for that. So make a copy of QuickBooks Online. That is possible. You can create a new QuickBooks Online account. You can upgrade your QuickBooks Online account to the version that has this capability where you can create a duplicate account of it and then downgrade it back when you're done. So create a duplicate of QuickBooks Online or create a copy of your QuickBooks Desktop. Rename it so it doesn't look the same. Give it a different name. Call it Sandbox for inventory software, something like that. And then connect the Sandbox inventory software and test out how the inventory software communicates with QuickBooks. When does it create invoices in QuickBooks? When does it create payments in QuickBooks? When does it create bills in QuickBooks? Manufacturing adjustments, cycle count adjustments. How does it map to the customer records and the vendor records? Like, become familiar with how the inventory software connects to QuickBooks. You wouldn't believe how many customers I've helped that say, oh, we connected the inventory software to QuickBooks and it's a mess, and so we shut it off. And so what we do is we create the Sandbox, right? And take a look at how it works and sit down with the accountant, sit down with the operations manager, get together and talk about what you need and what your needs are and how the inventory software and the accounting software will be set up in a way that meets both of your needs, both departments, the warehouse and the office. When you implement inventory software and connect it to QuickBooks, it really brings the departments together, and that's a good thing. So that's a good conversation to have. So setup. Step 2 of a successful inventory software implementation is set up a Sandbox. Now, usually this is when the question comes up, well, gosh, do we have to do this all over again when we go live? No. And the reason why, most of the work that goes into setting up a Sandbox is preparing data and cleaning up data and making decisions, making best practice decisions on the setup. This is a time where you can even test a Sandbox of Shopify or WooCommerce, or this is a good environment for if you're connecting EDI to your software. You need a test environment, right? Going back to what I said earlier, the larger you are, the larger your company is, the more it makes sense to test. And the smaller your company is, then the less testing you need to do, or if you're tiny, then you may not need testing. But anyways, going back to the big question, well, gosh, Lance, this is a lot of work setting up this Sandbox. What about go live day? Do we have to do this all over again? The answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is because we don't have to reconfigure data. We don't have to clean up data. We don't have to make decisions. We either call the support team and say, hey, make a copy of this, and they make a copy of the list type data, which is different from the transactional data. So in step 3, we're going to test further and create processes and procedures. Be sure to watch my video on step 3. Step 4, we're going to give everyone time to practice. So there's going to be all kinds of junk in this Sandbox that we don't want. But there's also going to be good stuff that we want. We want the correct costs. We want the correct prices. We want the correct part numbers. We want the correct bills of material. We want the customers set up exactly how we want them set up, right? That's the reason we're doing the Sandbox, is so when we find a problem in our step 3 procedural design, or if we find a problem with our step 4 training and practice, then we can fix it in this practice file with the understanding that right before go live, as part of our go live checklist, we are going to export the list type data. So list type data is your customers, your vendors, your parts, your locations, your prices, and account mapping. It's the things that don't change or hardly change. Transactional data is sales orders and or live sales orders that have been picked and packed and shipped. If you receive something, that's a transaction, right? So it's transactional data. So usually the go live day, when you set it up again in the live account and connect it to the live QuickBooks, takes about 4 hours usually. It's just a process of exporting your data out of the Sandbox and importing it into the live. So when I started creating sandboxes, when I started encouraging my customers to create a sandbox, we started seeing much, much more success. Like I said, if you're small, onesie, twosie, 3 user, you can probably skip this step and just create a live file. You might be able to just set up the file and start using it, but not the people I work with. Usually the 5 users, 10, 15, 20, 30, you need a sandbox. So just plan on that in your implementation project. I'm Lance, inventory software expert since 2006, done over 300 implementations. Please learn from my successes and my failures. Each one of these steps comes from successful experiences and failed experiences. Our failures we learn the most from. And hope this video helps. If you want to view more videos like this, subscribe. Comment below if you want to share some of your implementation experiences. Comment below if you have a question about something I said, something didn't make sense. And be sure to like if you like this video.